we're just going to have a little fun today. You know, this is an interesting topic, one that is very difficult to teach practically from a literal practical sense. Teaching dialogue is you know, there's nothing really practical about dialogue. But it's learnable. But we have a page on the ISA site called Pro Tips. You should go and check it out. There are a ton of videos on there. And one of the things I'm going to be doing in our webinar today is showing you some videos as examples. But, you know, we have to be focusing ourselves on education as much as possible. You're all here taking part in this class for that very reason, to be a part of a community, yes, but for educational purposes. So that's what I focus on. That's my title with the ISA, Director of Education. I'm also the VP of Development with our production and development company that's on the side of the ISA, where we play in the producing game. But I'm always, you know, focusing as much on education as possible because it's the only way we're going to improve. So cheers to you all. Bravo to you all for joining us here. Dialogue is very difficult to teach from a practical level. You know, if you have or hear someone say, here's how you do it, you know, take it with a grain of salt. You can always learn something from somebody. And I say in the craft course, my online coursework, that, you know, if a consultant tries to have you sign up for a week or 2 week long course on how to write dialogue, you know, do your research. It's of course, I always tell people, take classes, whether they're good or bad, you're going to learn something. But, you know, it's difficult to teach somebody how to write great dialogue because there's something that is just deep within you. You have to, it's something you feel after a while, as little help as that is. But I'm going to be talking about a few things that can help you do that. I also have some videos I'm going to show. I'm going to cheat a little bit. One of them is kind of a breakdown of what a particular channel on YouTube thinks are the top 10 movies with the best dialogue. Whether you agree with them or not, that's really not the point. But I'm going to show you that. You can find that on your own. It's called WatchMojo is the YouTube channel. You've probably heard of them. They have some fun lists and stuff. But I watched it and I thought, you know what? They make some really good points. It's fun to see some examples of scenes, but then I have longer scenes I'm going to show also. So dialogue. The best way to break down dialogue in the simplest way, and this is what I tell all of my writers when I'm consulting them, I'm working, you know, one-on-one with them, we have weekly calls, etc. We get to that stage of writing dialogue, is that you have to make sure that your dialogue is completely set within the intentions of the character saying the line, regardless of the character. And those intentions are completely immersed within that character's emotional flaw. Now that term is kind of cliche, incredibly broad. You know, we can go much further into emotional flaw, but the best way to understand emotional flaw is, you know, an inner wound, the beliefs that character has, something that emotionally or psychologically is holding that character back from being the best version of that person. Whether that person becomes the best version of that character by the end of the movie or not, there is still something that is holding that character back. It's the whole purpose of going on this journey, whether it's a feature or a TV show, I'll explain that in a second. That character is learning something. For TV, it's a little different because you don't see the arc as quickly, right? You know, by the end of a movie, you see the arc of a character. The character changes in some way by the end, whether a big way or a small way. They learn some kind of lesson by doing something that they hadn't been able to do before because of the flaw. So you really have to have a full, complete understanding of your character. And by saying full and complete, I mean you can put this character in quite literally any make-believe situation, and you know what that character is going to say and how that character is going to react based on, you know, the very general way of saying it. Who is this person? What do they believe? What hurt them in the past? What are their fears? Because if you look at yourself in any everyday life situation, you're going to say something, a line of dialogue, we'll say that, coming from your own level of intentions and wants and desires and motivations, no matter how big or small the situation might be, right? In a movie or a TV show, you know, we have to up the ante of the uniqueness of the dialogue, of the line itself, right? Because it's real life, but it's an elevated version of real life. So we have to allow then entertainment to play a role. Otherwise, you just have people talking about what they're going to have for dinner, and you're like, you want spaghetti? Sure. What kind of spaghetti? I don't know, penne. Okay, cool. Do you like red sauce? I'll do white sauce. Really? I mean, there's nothing entertaining about that conversation. So that's what I mean by, an elevated version of real life. So we don't want to deliver a line that you think the audience wants to hear or expects to hear. So that would be, if I had like 1 minute with all of you, and the best advice I can give you about dialogue is to be unexpected. The issue with that advice, and I'm calling myself out, is that after a while within a story, the audience is going to get to know your character so well that even an unexpected line becomes expected, because we've gotten to know who that character is. And I'm going to show an example of that in a little bit. But by unexpected is that the character is not just always going to directly respond to a line of dialogue, right? Like to answer it. Sometimes they will, of course, it's all extremely situational. But you want to deliver a line of dialogue that the character needs to say in that particular situation, right? So not only is a line of dialogue rooted in what a character ultimately wants, like what I was saying, especially during, the situation at hand, but it's also matching the flaw of that character. And that's a tricky piece of advice, because how do you then understand, well, in a theoretical sense, okay, the character is going to be coming from this inner place, but it means you have to do full character development. Like before you ever write a line of dialogue, this is why I talk to my writers so thoroughly about the need to do so much front-end work before you ever get to the pages of writing a script. Because the issue of jumping right to Final Draft or Movie Magic Screenwriter, Writer Duet, whatever screenwriting software you use, is that we end up falling in love with the process of writing the dialogue, right? Because that's the fun part. That's where we start to really feel creative, because you're having some great lines or, responses. It's either a comedy or it's a drama or whatever it might be. You're just enjoying that process of, here's a great, zinger, which, yes, that's fun. But if you haven't done any of the work on the other 3 levels of development, which I think last month's webinar was about, concept, character, structure, page work meaning the dialogue, the scene direction, the scene headings, parentheticals, transitions, blah, 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 primarily dialogue. If you haven't done any of the work on the previous 3 levels, how do you really know what a character is going to say, or how they're going to say it, or why they would say something? How do you allow a line of dialogue to define a character without needing a whole situation to show who that character is and what they're going to do? Obviously, there is a huge level of importance set on showing instead of telling. You've all heard that. But nonetheless, I'm kind of going roundabout here. I'm just looking at my notes. I apologize if it looks like I'm reading, because sometimes I am. But yeah, matching the flaw of that particular character, you have to understand what the flaw is. You have to understand what the wound is. What hurt this person? What are they afraid of? But in some ways, flaws aren't always a bad thing either. If someone is devoted to their career, that's not a bad thing. But it becomes bad, if you will, a flaw, if they are then, ignoring their family, or they're becoming selfish. They're trying to, ruin somebody else's career so that they can become, successful. That's when it turns into a flaw. But there can be a sweet and sourness to your so-called flaw. That's why I always, do the air quotes around the word flaw, because flaw tends to come with this negative connotation. And it doesn't always have to be, I don't know why my brain always goes here, and everybody will probably laugh, but I mention National Treasure with Nicolas Cage all the time. Mainly because most of us have seen it. If you haven't, then you're probably not watching TV, because it's on some channel every day. And just because it's structurally sound, it's entertaining. I'm in no way, shape, or form am I saying it's the best movie ever made, but it's a good example for basic reasons. Nicolas Cage's character, his flaw is that he's obsessed. But he's obsessed for the right reasons, right? He's obsessed with the need to prove his family right. His name, family name is not, a bad thing. He wants to be vindicated. So he's obsessed with this need to be vindicated. And that's then what is driving his actions. It's also what is then driving how he responds to certain situations, because not only is he obsessed, he's incredibly knowledgeable. He's a little bit of a know-it-all, and then all the other little things that fall down from obsessed, right? And it's that particular type of obsession. So that version of obsessed isn't necessarily a bad thing until it becomes something where you find out in the sequel that he gets a divorce with his wife because he was too obsessed. So anyway, you know, the irony here is that this webinar could very easily turn into a webinar about character development, because you can't have dialogue without developing your character. The other side of this is that you really can't have or understand how to write solid dialogue without having an understanding of, Muggs is saying he just watched National Treasure last week because it was on. Exactly. This is why I used the example. Anyway, so, oh shoot, now I've looked at the chat box, of course, and I lost my, train of thought. So structure. I want to talk about structure just a little bit because dialogue is also very situational, right? What a character says depends on the situation they're in. I mean, that's an obvious note, but situation can also mean structural in terms of where we are in the script. Because if you have a character that you're introducing in your first sequence, you know, the first 8-10 pages, whatever it might be, that character is going to be a little bit further entrenched within that character's flaw, issue, belief system, world, whatever else you want to call it. So those lines of dialogue may be a little different than when they're in sequence 8, which is around, you know, page 75 or something. We're nearing the low point of the end of the second act. Those lines of dialogue will sound a little different. They're going to be a little different. And, you know, one of the videos or one of the clips in this longer video I show from the YouTube channel, WatchMojo, they reference Casablanca. And it's such a great example because you do see how Rick, you know, Humphrey Bogart's character, is so jaded at the beginning. And so much so you're like, what the heck, this guy's a dick, right? But we see him soften as the movie goes on. And this is a structural thing. This is a logistical approach to the story, right? He changes, so does his dialogue. So that's what I mean by needing to understand structure on top of the character development, or vice versa, character development on top of the structure, in order to understand what kind of line you're delivering. And again, it's all based on situation. Let me just hit some of these comments here. So let's see, Christy's saying, okay, so she's showing an example. Mike, yeah, right. How are you? Suicidal, and you? Great, great. The family all good for the moment. Glad to hear it. Listen, I have a favor to ask. See, that's funny because there is a level of unexpectability. Totally just made that word up. When he says suicidal and you, great, great. And because then she responds with great, family all good? Like she's not even listening. But what we want to also understand is, you know, there's so much that can go into just seeing those lines of dialogue, right? Because where does that come from? Or I should say, where does that fit structurally? If this is the opening scene, now we're looking at very real character presentation. We get a glimpse into who these characters are without having known them at all. So it's great. If we see these characters say these things late in the script, is that, you know, the best way to be presenting who, because we don't necessarily need character presentation in terms of who they are, unless there is a situation that is evolving around the scene where this is being stated. Very difficult. This is what I mean. It's very difficult to teach dialogue because it's so relative to so many things. Genre even, you know, this I'm assuming is a little bit of a comedy. I don't know that though. So it's difficult to look at just some lines of dialogue and then go, sure, great line, you know. The great lines we remember can easily be taken out of context, you know, like an Austin Powers line or something that Jim Carrey says in Ace Ventura. You know, you can throw it in other situations and it's just a line. True dialogue are two or more people having the dialogue, right? It's not just a voiceover or some long monologue. Which of course you can call that dialogue, but true behavioral responses are said between two or more people, and that's how we're getting to see these people change. Even in Castaway with Tom Hanks, you're seeing him talk to Wilson. They had to put something there for him to talk to, otherwise it'd be a silent film. So through that, we were able to see how Tom's character starts to evolve. My 3-year-old is watching with me. Okay, Emily, I will make sure to be kind with my language. Let's see. So Julia is saying Supernatural is predictable somewhat. For sure, my favorite show, but how do you make the main characters interesting for a few seasons? It's incredibly impressive when you have a show like a West Wing or even a Supernatural or Grey's Anatomy, which is unbelievable it's still on the air, to continue for that long, for so many seasons. What Supernatural, West Wing, Grey's Anatomy, what those shows have primarily is a really interesting situation overall from a conceptual standpoint that you can repeat over and over and over and over and over again. And it usually will stay entertaining. Those characters then, and this is going back to what I was saying about TV, those characters don't really change. They learn some lessons, they might evolve a little bit. But the way they react to the situations they're in are pretty much always going to be the same. And that's why we tune in, because we know what to expect, right? There's a level of, again, expectability in TV. And so that's why it's one of your favorite shows, Julia, because it's like coming home a little bit. It's comfortable. You don't have to think that hard with Supernatural sometimes, right? Sometimes it draws some level of a message or theme that you're like, wow, that's kind of cool or interesting, but it's just about the fun of it. And so those lines of dialogue sometimes can be a little predictable. For writers who have not been produced, writers who have yet to, make a splash around town, you have to show off a little bit, because you have to be presenting your talent, because your talent is ultimately what people are going to notice before they're necessarily the project that you're presenting them. And sometimes it's the other way around. You have such a great idea, people are like, oh my God, I want the script. Anyway, it's a whole other conversation. But so we got another kid too, expectancy. Thank you, Mary. That is the better way of saying it. And you're correcting me, which is good. Kevin is asking an interesting question. I will say, I may end up missing some of the questions in the comments. So make sure to put it in the Q&A box logo icon down at the bottom of the screen, so I don't miss it, because I will go through all of your Q&As or questions at the end of this. You can ask anything, obviously, preferably about dialogue, because that's the topic, but you can ask anything you need. Kevin's asking, is character talking to themselves under their breath to demonstrate a character flaw and point too gratuitous, or is it okay to slip in once in a while? I think the easier answer is it's okay to slip in once in a while. But I do see it a lot in screenplays. And more often than not, I would say 98% of the time, I'm telling writers, you probably don't need it. If the character has some level of emotional quality to them that is rooted in, OCD or anxiety, if they're talking to themselves because it's showing more than just a level of exposition, it's showing character and their emotional, issues, positive or negative. Okay, then I'm all right with them talking under their breath or something. But again, it's a little situational. And then, I would try to use it as sparingly as possible, because it does end up turning into just information for the reader. And that's one of the last things we want to do with our writing. We don't want to just be presenting information. We want to be presenting entertainment. And this is one of the mentions in the WatchMojo video. Quentin Tarantino is a master at that. He somehow just innately understands how to get exposition in through the dialogue while still keeping it really sharp and hiding it a little bit. There isn't a direct, obvious, let's sit down and talk about the exposition. Like there's a great scene in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade where Indiana is brought into this auditorium and there are two government officials and they're wanting to talk to him about his father being kidnapped. So what's interesting about that scene is that it's extremely expositional, but what you notice is how Indiana is reacting to the information and how he is then revealing additional exposition and information. He's really excited. Also nervous and scared, obviously, because his dad's been kidnapped. He doesn't know where he is. But we see character through the exposition coming out. We see how excited he is about this information. because he's like, oh my God, I can't believe that you're talking about the Holy Grail, blah, blah, blah. I don't know exactly. I can't remember exactly what was stated, but it's a cool scene to study because, for one, you know, that movie, it's in itself it does have a lot of information you're going to have to get across. It's an adventure. There's history there. There's an item they're trying to retrieve. We need to know about the item. You don't need heavy expositional scenes in certain dramas or comedies. There are ways to get it out through dialogue, but it's just a good scene to study. When writing dialogue in historically set scripts, how do you determine whether they sound historically accurate enough to be believable? You know, Debbie, it's a really good question. I think the only answer is just research, research, research. You know, try to find as many YouTube clips as you can that that has some of that same dialect. You know, the types of words these people might use. Google and YouTube, free. That's my best piece of advice there. You know, how do you determine whether they sound historically accurate? You have to hear it elsewhere, right? Otherwise, you don't know. The audience will assume that this is how they talked. So you have a little bit of a, you know, mastery that you have to get to. Is it a cop-out to use narration to give more information about the character rather than fine-tuned dialogue? I mean, cop-out might be a little, Liz is asking this, by the way, but little bit of a harsh way of saying it. But yeah, it usually feels that way to the reader. You know, to a reader who reads 12 to 15 scripts a week, they're going to be like, oh, come on, just give me a different way to consume the information. You know, the best narration in voiceover, in my opinion, Juno is a great example because that narration is just purely rooted in character. It is so, and Molly's Game is another great example. But it's just like Juno, you're understanding who the character is through the way that narration is being stated. It's not just information. It's not just, you know, many years ago in a galaxy far, far away. You know, there's a character essence giving this so-called information, but so much so, it feels like commentary. It's commentary on what we're seeing. Let the visuals tell us and give us the information. And information doesn't always just have to be plot. And that's the hard part. You have to allow for the plot to be advanced through dialogue by way of the character motivation and intention and wants and desires. That's difficult. It's very difficult to do. So in a way, you have to figure out a way to combine the two. You know, you can't just have straight dialogue where it's, here's the plot. You have to allow for the combination. You know, if a character is rooted and you understand who your character is in terms of a flaw-based level, if they're rooted in that while giving some of the plot, great. That's what Indiana Jones does in Last Crusade. So, and you know, a lot of people, like Olga is saying, that Molly's Game was killed by narration, and I, you know, a lot of times agree. Sometimes it can help. Sometimes it's interesting. One thing about Molly's Game is that they were trying to cover many years of time. And, you know, you sometimes have to thread them together. It's also Aaron Sorkin, who is just naturally gifted in that way, you know. And here we have a reference, Timothy saying Sunset Boulevard. That's one of the movies referenced in the video I'm going to show. That voiceover, again, is so rooted in character. You really get a sense of who the person is by way of the character saying the information. So again, it goes all the way back to, I need to understand who my character is thoroughly. In any situation I put them in, how are they going to say a line? Okay, let's have a little fun. And again, put your questions and comments even in, I don't know about comments, but your specific questions into the Q&A portion there so I don't miss them. But let's watch some videos here and just have some fun. We are probably only going to go maybe an hour here, but obviously whatever you have in terms of questions. And we do have one more here. How about this? Before we dive into the video, Maura is asking, rather than the character talking to themselves, what about them, quote unquote, talking in their head? We hear what they are thinking at certain moments. Do you think that can be a better option? So if it's a true conceit of your movie or show, conceit meaning something that's really unique. There's an old movie from on HBO called Dream On. I don't know if anybody watched it. I couldn't really watch it because I was young at the time, but I watched reruns later. And it was really fun because you got to see what the character was saying or thinking by way of cutaways to, like, if I'll give an example. If the main character received some, bombshell piece of information that scared him, we would cut away to a nuclear bomb going off. And they did this a lot, like throughout the episode. You would see inside of his head, but through visual and not necessarily dialogue. That works because it was kind of funny. You got to see the reaction to the character. We hadn't really seen it before in a TV show. So, if it's inherent to the story, like it's not something that's just going to happen maybe once or twice, and it happens, a lot, and it's really unique and interesting, and we're learning about the plot as we go by way of what this character is saying in the character's head, maybe. But, ultimately, is there a way for him to have a relationship, or her, with another character so that we can still have some of the same back and forth? That's just more interesting, that we can be engaged as an audience in that way if we're seeing two people have this, literal relationship unfold on camera. Do you think flashbacks would be a good idea if I use it in a movie? Usually I'm just outright no. Flashbacks take us out of the current moment. That being said, flashbacks work sometimes. So I happen to be of the opinion that flashbacks don't work more often than they do, mainly because I read so many scripts, and writers tend to rely on these flashbacks only for reasons of plot information. Here's what happened, as opposed to a flashback that reveals true character, a mystery or a thread that's like, oh, what's that supposed to mean? And then we come back. And again, it's kind of like the voices in the head situation. If you have one or two flashbacks, it's like, well, okay, but how necessary is it if it's just one or two? If it's something that's innate and inherent in the storytelling, and we're going back and forth, and suddenly maybe it becomes something that's unique part of the story, the flashbacks, then, maybe they can work. But I would try to figure out a way to, look at what you have in your flashbacks and think, okay, what can I do to keep this in the present moment? Because if you think of it from an audience's experience, they're kind of going linearly through this story, learning information about the characters, the plot, et cetera. Who am I supposed to root for? Who am I supposed to hate? What am I supposed to want? And, little lessons along the way. And then suddenly they're pulled out, and they go all the way back to 1879, and they're like, whoa, okay, so now I have to focus on this. And then boom, we're going to come back to present day, and it's jarring. Whether that's good or bad, it's still jarring no matter what. So the audience has to respond to that. And more often than not, it takes the reader out of the script, audience out of the movie. One last thing I think that's really important is something that we don't always think about when dialogue is concerned, but what are we as writers trying to say? And I know that sounds so broad, but I mean it from a message standpoint. What theme are we trying to present? From anything from, love conquers all to major social or cultural change, something that you're trying to show how difficult it is to live in a certain neighborhood, or, whatever it might be. What are you trying to say, and how are you trying to change the minds of the audience? Even if it's just a little bit. Even in Liar, Liar, Jim Carrey is showing, look what can happen if you lie. Look what happens if you tell the truth. So there's even just a tiny bit of a message that's coming out, even in a high concept comedy. You really have to be coming from a place then with your dialogue, with little bits here and there of lessons, not necessarily just outright preaching, but through the arguments and the conversations people have, reactions some of the characters have to situations, we're going to understand at a very low unconscious level, low is the right way of saying it, but an unconscious level, what we're supposed to be feeling. I don't know if anybody's watched the Chicago 7 on Netflix. It's another Sorkin movie. I really enjoyed it. Apparently, not exactly how it happened. He, changed it around a little bit to be on the side of the rebels. I am on the side of the rebels, the people that were protesting. I think they were protesting for right reasons. Apparently, historically speaking, they were very, very difficult in the courtroom. You know, there was not all, you know, peaches and cream where their reactions were concerned in real life. And so Sorkin decided to paint this in a slightly different way so that we were more on their side than, you know, we may have been had we seen it outright. So that's what you have to be thinking about, because the dialogue is going to be presenting the messages and lessons and what are we supposed to be learning. I'm going to show two clips of from two movies. You've probably seen them both. If you haven't, you should. One of them is extremely depressing, just to be, you know, fair warning. And if you do have kids around, there is foul language, so you may want to, you know, either mute or watch the recording later, or just politely ask them to, you know, find something else to stare at. But I'll show those two, and then I'll show the WatchMojo video. It'll be probably a total of 20 minutes or so of the videos, so it'll bring us relatively close to the hour. But yeah, you're welcome, Mary. So the first one is written by Noah Baumbach, who, whether you've heard his name or not, he wrote The Marriage Story. It's going to be much less many other things, but that's one of the clips I'm going to show. Very famous scene at this point. But what we want to focus on is the characters not always responding directly to what the other character is saying until they do, and then, you know, consider, well, what is it that made the character outright respond to something that the character just said? And what I mean by this is, and you'll see it, is that one character says one thing, another character says something, yes, in response, but it isn't an answer necessarily to what the character is saying. This character is sharing his, you know, his beliefs. This character is sharing her beliefs, until one character says something a little harsher than she responds to what that says. And then it just keeps ratcheting up and ratcheting up. And what you notice, especially within this, Christy, the presidential debates, right? Especially in this scene, in this movie, these characters are trying to win, right? They're trying to beat the other one. They're trying to say something that's going to hurt a little bit more than the other person just said, until it blows up. Obviously, an argument. Great scene. It is really an amazing scene. Let's take the acting out of it, right? It's too easy to focus on how amazing the acting is there. It's too easy because we're seeing it. What you have to focus on is what they were saying to each other in response. The primary, I mean, obviously, yeah, no drama without conflict, quite a bit of conflict there, but you have to look deeper into what they're thinking and feeling and why they are, which is not hard to see. But this, you have to come from a place of, how do I write that scene, right? It's one thing to just say horrible things to each other. You can make a list of the worst things you could say to people, you know, in your life. That's the easy part. How to ratchet up the rhythm, the momentum and the tempo, because it's already, you know, at 11. It's already there. How do you make it worse and bigger and more, you know, just awful? And it's by them just trying to say one other thing that's more hurtful. And then allowing one, like you noticed there was a spot where Scarlett Johansson's character pauses because he's maybe telling the truth. We don't know if she thinks that or not, but it's like extra hurtful. So she pauses a little bit and she doesn't say as much. That's another key point in dialogue here, is that what a character doesn't say is just as or more important than what they do, because what you see at the end of that scene, I wrote in my notes, the actions at the end of the scene show us even more than the dialogue. It shows us what they're really thinking and feeling, that they maybe didn't really mean all of what they said. So the non-dialogue, the non-verbal cues is just as much a part of the dialogue as what they're saying. So let's see what everybody else is saying here in the comments. Yeah, neither character says you hurt me, but that's subtext in the intent, right? It seemed like he was mourning the things he didn't do. I couldn't catch what she was angry, sad about. I mean, it is difficult taking the scene out of context because obviously we haven't seen the whole movie, but it eventually comes out, she's probably a little upset that he did cheat on her. I mean, that's, you know, that's one thing, but it's also, it comes out where she says, I can't believe I have to live the rest of my life with you. I can't remember how she said the line exactly, or always knowing you. Like that's that's so much worse than you hurt me, right? Like what Mark is saying. This scene threw me out of the story. It felt forced and unnatural, even for a pair of theater people. Am I the only one? So that's a really good point, Sherry, because you can probably tell that this was one of the scenes that Noah focused the most on. He knew it was going to be really, impactful. That's the other important part about scene writing, is that they all have to live with all the other scenes, right? It's easy for me as an educator at the moment to show the scene and go, look how amazing this was, right? You can't just write one scene and then call it a movie. You have all these other scenes that have to fit, that build up to this and then fall away from it, and then build up to something else and then fall away from that. So it's, again, going back to character and structure. You have to know your characters so well that you can then start to see how they're going to react within certain situations logistically throughout the script. Let's see. Yeah, push buttons is one definite way of saying it. It shows what their breaking point is the character, and it's infidelity, yes. I would also say that it's narcissism. Like Adam Driver's character really, when he asks that, what does that have to do with LA? That was the light for her to say, you're so selfish. Like, well, this has nothing to do with LA. She could have said that line, this has nothing to do with LA. But that's a direct response to what he just said. So then the writer's going, I don't want her to say it has nothing to do with LA. She is going to say something else, coming from a place of her own frustration and motivation. She wants to be right? So she's going to come right out and say something unexpected, right? So the expected line would be, this doesn't have anything to do with LA. So that's what I mean a little bit in terms of the level of, being unexpected. Yeah, I can't believe I have to know you forever. I mean, what a great line. Yeah, what does that have to do with LA? I've seen the entire film. It was great. The dialogue was super intense. Yeah, I agree that the characters were saying, you hurt me, without verbally saying it. So it's the moment when you know they're going to divide. It also asks, how do they come back from, I wish you were dead? Yeah, I mean, how do you come back from that? And really, it's also a microcosm of the whole thing, in terms of going back to what I was saying about wanting to know for yourself, what am I trying to say? The overall question is, how do I come back from a divorce? When we have a child together, we have a life together. We have a life not only in the past, but we have to know each other forever. How do you come back from that? How do you accept that? Like, these are all these questions that you have to be asking about the general concept of the story you're writing. What kind of questions do I want the audience to unconsciously be asking themselves? Sometimes it's obvious. You may not be writing the marriage story or the next marriage story. Some are a little bit more obvious in terms of themes. Disney Pixar movies, so obvious, but it's okay, because that's the type of movie it is. Was it the actors who decided to shout over each other, or would that be written into the scene? So definitely written into the scene, but it's also directing. Noah Baumbach also directed this, so he knew how this was going to be. But if you were to read that scene, even without exclamation points, it's still pretty rough in terms of what they're saying, the literal words coming out of their mouth. But also the actions, if you notice the blocking, she's kind of just sort of swiveling, slightly moving around. He's like pacing, frenetic, opening and closing the cabinets. He sits down for a moment, then he stands up, he punches the wall. So those are all things we need to be considering, the blocking and how they walk, how they stand next to each other, when they get close to each other's face, when they don't. Those are things the writer can focus on. You don't want to over direct, which, there needs to be a balance, but the writer does need to set the scene. You've probably all seen this scene too, or movie too, but I'm not going to set it up. I just want you to, considering what we were just talking about in terms of character motivations, intentions, being unexpected, coming from a place of flaw. Just keep, thinking about all that stuff. Blocking is a little different in this scene because the characters are so far apart. What Sorkin does so well, I mean, obviously in the marriage story scene, there's a momentum to that scene. But like I was saying, it kind of begins with this, 100, it starts with 100 and keeps going. Here, we're starting at a little bit of a lower level, and you can see and feel the rhythm a little bit more with how these two are battling each other, especially with Steve Jobs in terms of his narcissism and how he does not want to lose. He is incapable of losing. And it's coming out through the way he's telling nobody move, he's responding to the woman with the headset on. he's refusing to move on the stage. Wozniak is trying to, diffuse it a little bit. You can see so much just by literally the visuals, but then what he's saying, yes, there is more response in this scene to, Steve is saying this, Wozniak saying that, and it's a little bit more of a back and forth in terms of answers, but it's still unexpected. There's still a level of, encapsulate their relationship, their struggle, right? And this is obviously a key scene in the movie because it's presenting Sorkin's, approach to how should we be thinking of Steve Jobs. But you notice how the scene ends. Wozniak gets the last word. And I'm pretty confident that Sorkin knew that going in. How do I show that Steve at least maybe learned something? Kind of. And it's by allowing Wozniak to have a last word. Figuring out what that last word is going to be is, obviously that's difficult, but because you have to just come up with the line. But he probably had this idea of it's not binary. You can be gifted in decency and decent. It's a tricky process to break down a scene because I don't know how Sorkin literally wrote it down. Maybe it was completely linear. There's a couple drafts and he nailed it, or it was non-linear and he was bouncing from the end to the beginning. I don't know, but you have to be able to notice just each other trying to win, right? The other one's trying to get someone else to do something based completely on what they want and what they're motivated for and about. Let's see. It's too much shouting at each other. Dialogue surely also about conversations, not verbal text. Totally, absolutely. So these are, and that's where the WatchMojo scene is gonna, or video is gonna help, because most of those scenes in that WatchMojo video that I'll show are not just people screaming at each other. These are exaggerated versions so that you can understand how unexpected lines can be in response to somebody else coming from this flawed place. I'm trying to win, right? It revealed the heart of the loss, which is solid, solid comment. So I totally get what M. Hepton, sorry, I don't see the name there, is saying, because it does, after a while, just get annoying if people are just screaming at each other all the time. So not all great dialogue has to be an argument. Some great dialogue is just within a moment. What does somebody say? Like there's a line from, again, I go to Liar, Liar, I guess because I've used it as such an example, but Jim Carrey's kind of in the middle of being unable to tell a lie, and he's well, okay, there's a little bit of an argument, but he's going back and forth with his ex-wife, and he admits, because of his inability to tell a lie, the truth comes out, and he says, "I'm a bad father." And it was not only in the way he delivered the line, because that's an acting thing, but it's also situational, because we understand his problem of unable to tell a lie, and not always the truth is going to come out. And suddenly it comes out, and he realizes, wow, until this moment, I didn't really realize I was a bad father. So yes, that took place in a little bit of an argument within Liar, Liar, but the point of that line is to show an evolution of the character. Almost every scene is going to show some amount of evolution of the character, at the very least an advancing of the plot, which is usually how TV works, obviously more than features, because the plot is what's advancing. The characters and how they're reacting within the situation is what is keeping us entertained. Their relationships, the B story, C story, sidelines, stories of the relationship stuff outside of the plot. There's a lot more that goes into TV. Dialogue still stays the same though. There's still a level of character flaw and emotional issues that need to be coming to play, rooted in that line. This is really more just kind of fun, but there are some really excellent points that they make. And I'll review some of the more important ones when we're done. There are some really solid nuggets of advice that they mention in there. For one, develops character and advances the plot. So easy to say, but that's one point they made, that the great lines of dialogue, the great movies that have great dialogue, do both at the same time. That is not easy to do, and that kind of brings me back to the very beginning, is that I don't know if there's anybody that can practically teach you how to do that, other than pushing you to read as many scripts as possible, really study films as much as you can, come to this level of feeling, and again, I just repeat myself that it's terrible advice, but dialogue is something that you eventually just become connected to. There's a feeling that you have with, you know, when a line is right. You don't want to be overstating things. And then, what was it? Yeah, serve and support the theme, that like 12 Angry Men and so many other things. What are you trying to say as the writer? How can you weave this in without hitting people over the head with it through the dialogue? How they say it, you know, they mentioned something about Casablanca, and Casablanca really is such a great example of a near perfect movie, in my opinion, because the structure is all great. And, you know, you start out with Rick being a very specific type of person. His response is like, I'm a drunkard. You know, that's rooted in emotional flaw and his, you know, wanting to misbehave and all these things. Until, as the movie continues going, we see that this woman softened him up, right? It was extremely difficult for him to go through that process. And now that she's back in his life, he's kind of, you know, he's learning something. He's letting her go at the end. And then I think the key point to remember in 12 Angry Men is an obvious example of this, but you can see this in a lot of different movies, even in the Marriage Story scene, where they said, reach a conclusion through different perspectives. From a literal thematic and message-based standpoint, you know, yeah, we have two perspectives. Allow the audience to come up with their own perspective. That's the point of the movie in general, but we're going to do it through dialogue. But we're also going to have, you know, one character who believes in something, another character who believes in something, and based on the story you're trying to tell, you're going to be saying this character's belief is probably the better way of believing, trying to stay politically correct. And then, yeah, it shows, obviously, dialogue shows how a character feels without saying, here's how I feel. And I think that would be a nice note to finish on. I'll get to some of these questions here in a second. But, you know, just outright saying, here's how I'm feeling, it's not like you can't have a character do that, but you really have to look at the situation at hand. Is it entertaining in the moment for a character to say, I feel this way, and be blunt about it? It's everything is relative to the scene, to the sequence, to the act, to the show, to the movie, to so many things. So hopefully you learned a little something out of all of this. Yeah, like Sherry is saying, there's no coincidence. At least two of these came from the theatrical stage, turned into or came from stage productions. It's true. Playwrights, they only have dialogue really to deal with. So you have to make it entertaining. Let's look at some of these questions. All right. How do you get exposition across in dialogue while at the same time being natural and not on the nose? Hopefully some of my comments throughout all of this, the whole webinar here helped answer that, Joe. It's a tough one to answer because it's relative to the scene. But if you have that character giving the information, the exposition from a character level perspective, Quentin Tarantino is a great example of how to do that. Then the exposition doesn't seem so just outright over your head, just like the Indiana Jones scene when they're talking about the Grail and they're talking about all these things with the government officials. It's exciting because we see how excited Indiana is. How do you create dialogue for all your characters that make the characters distinct and different? I mean, that's a really big question, Joe. Really big question. But understanding what each character wants and their personalities. It's kind of like playing Dungeons and Dragons, with your script. You have all these characters, you got to roll the dice, for Dungeons and Dragons, and it's random. But for you and your screenplay, it doesn't have to be random. You can choose. Here's who I think this character is. Here are their beliefs. Here what their desires, what they want, their flaws. You have to do that for every one of your characters, and then can come from a place of a little bit of a schizophrenia inside of you. You have to be able to allow for a distinct nature in all of your individual characters that will then relay into a distinct voice. Voice from a character is ultimately just motivation and intent. Muggs is asking, can you expand that a bit to podcast using dialogue to reveal character while also the fine line of exposition? I guess my question is, what is that fine line? Whew. It's a really good question, Muggs. What is the fine line? I think the line, at least, whether it's thick or fine, is when it's really long on the page, meaning as you're reading, you have like this much dialogue and it's pretty much just information. Here's what happened in the past, or we have to go do this, so we're going to, you know, because this one character wants this. And when you're just explaining things, as opposed to the same bit of information that you want to get across coming from a character saying it, either being afraid of it or really excited about it, or they have an opinion about it. There are ways to blend the two so it doesn't feel like it's just explaining. You don't want it just some teacher at the front of the class, you know, here's the lecture for the day. So I think that's where the fine line is somewhere. It's the difference between character presentation of the information and just explaining information. So if it's only plot related stuff, and it doesn't have to be this really long line, it could just be, you know, a back and forth between two characters over the phone and they're just talking about, here's the situation, you know, how can you spruce that up? And it's the character reacting to it, or, you know, coming from this level of opinion or belief. Emily, I'm writing a romantic comedy dramedy TV show where 7 couples will get together over time in a town. I've heard people say each character needs to have their own unique voice. Can you share about this? I did kind of touch on that a little bit, Emily, before, but let's see. I can see each of my characters expressing their unique desires and fears through their dialogue, especially through subtext. Subtext is really important. Subtext doesn't always need to be through dialogue. Subtext can be like that moment at the end of the Marriage Story scene where they, like, Scarlett Johansson goes up and immediately puts her hand on his shoulder. He says, "I'm sorry." And she says, "Me too." And he's crying. Like this, that you could say is subtext in some ways, but it's really showing what they actually feel. Let's see. Does that make up their unique voice in terms of desires and fears? Yeah, it's part of it, but it's also perspective. What do they, you know, believe? Like Rick from Casablanca, he's completely jaded. He thinks the world is just a bunch of crap. You know, you have to think about personal beliefs because that's where that voice is going to be coming from. If many of the characters are from the same town, their accent and way of speaking is probably similar. Don't necessarily confuse accent with voice. Voice is personal belief. How they say the line in terms of dialect is part of shaping who the character is a little bit, but that's more of just the audio, you know, how we hear them say the line. Confused if I'm overthinking it, it's okay to just focus on the personality. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with giving characters a dialect, you know, an accent. It can help shape who that character is, but it's more important about thinking about those personal beliefs. Cheryl, in order to check the individual lead character voices so that they don't sound alike, is it effective to read through a script focusing on one character's dialogue separately? It can be. Not easy. I mean, when I was first learning the whole screenwriting process at, you know, at a higher level, I was forced to go through rewrite passes focusing only on one thing, only character dialogue. And it did help me stay organized, but it did also kind of make the process of rewriting quite long, which, you know, maybe the rewrite process needs to be long because writing is rewriting. But it can be effective, Cheryl, if you are able to focus for that long, because it takes a while to read through and rework a script. Naturally, we start reading other lines of dialogue, and we start, you know, you have to consider the scene that that line is in also. You have, what's the point of this scene from a thematic standpoint, from a character perspective or development standpoint? Where does it exist in the script? Is it sequence 3, meaning it's at the end of the first act? So we need to get this feeling of we're going to go on an adventure. There are a lot of questions that you have to be asking. So I would be careful to go through, you know, a script in that way without allowing yourself to see the big picture, because it can get a little overwhelming. Sorkin's Chicago 7, Eric Roth said, this is from Joe, the final Abby Hoffman speech was dialogue Sorkin made up to get his point across. Yeah, you know, that's the freedom of the screenwriter. Tara, here's a great scene in Kramer and Kramer, Kramer versus Kramer in the cafe when Meryl Streep comes back, says she wants their kid. Is writing dialogue different when writing a quiet scene that escalated versus one zinger after another when heated? In some ways, no. Most ways, no. Because you're still coming from a place of, what do I want the audience to feel from this scene? Where am I structurally? What's the point of the scene? Is someone going to win the scene? You know, does a character come into the scene wanting something? Do they get it? If they don't, what's the process of not getting it, not achieving it? so no, it really isn't that much of a difference. It's just about tempo, energy. The story in general, you know, Marriage Story is about divorce. So obviously there's going to be arguments, there's going to be hatred, there's going to be frustration and anger. Not every movie is going to have that. So Neil, how about a class on how to analyze people and characters? How about it? That's a, sure. I mean, I don't necessarily, I mean, I'm sure there are people who have launched a class like that. I don't know them offhand, but I'm hesitant to do it myself only because I'm not, you know, I'm not a psychology major. I don't necessarily tout myself as an expert on everybody's psyche. You do become better at it by reading characters and studying, you know, the works of incredible writers. But it's a good idea. There's nothing wrong with looking at that, because I think ultimately you come down to this understanding that there are archetypes, and you can Google archetypes and just find out all these different types, and then try to shape your characters around those archetypes. It gives you a little bit of an anchor. Joe says, thank you. I enjoyed the webinar. Thank you. Christy, is there any software that can analyze the percentage of a screenplay that is dialogue versus action? Does Final Draft do anything like this? I don't know, Christy. I really don't. I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. I mean, the easiest way is just to scroll through it and see how many pages am I focusing only on dialogue and how many actually has the scene direction on there. All right, folks, that is everything, I think, for me. But I do want to say that we are still offering 50% off the craft course. I will follow up with an email. If you want to take the course, I highly suggest it. It's only $50, 12 weeks, keep the course forever. And you can go through it as quickly or slowly as you want. I'm going to be updating it a lot with video and explanations and stuff as we go. It's going to look a little bit better. $50 as opposed to 99, actually $49.50. Save 50 cents. Anyway, I'll follow up with an email, but thank you, everybody. Just keep working hard, keep writing. The best thing you can do is read scripts, study movies, watch TV shows that you love, and work on that character development. And that's the best way to get this dialogue working. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon. Stay safe. Have a good week.